conference this weekend. Professor Ramsey is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Miami, where she's been teaching since 2006. She received her PhD at Columbia University in 2002, and she's the author of numerous articles, very important articles, I think, as someone who was interested in research on the Black Atlantic world, particularly that crucial formative period in the 1930s. Her article on Catherine Dunham and Melville Herskovits and the research on Haiti is, for me, a really fundamental piece of work that I learned so much from. And I continue to learn a lot from her work, and especially from her forthcoming book, The Spirits and the Law, Voodoo and Power in Haiti, which I think is really a tour de force of research and interpretation, which offers what I call a spellbinding history of the relationship between popular spiritual practice and the rule of law in Haiti. Its fine-grained analysis, its theoretical sophistication, all show the law to be a fickle spirit, really, a powerful but capricious force having the capacity to lie dormant for long periods of time and then form suddenly into a dangerous weapon of the church, the state, or of imperial oppression, while at the same time remaining susceptible to popular efforts to harness legal powers for beneficial ends. I hope she will speak a little bit about her book today in her lecture, which is going to be called Law Always Has a Trap Inside of It, Repression and Representation of Voodoo During the U.S. Occupation of Haiti, 1915 to 1934. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking Kate Ramsey for coming.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Vince, and thank you so much to Vince and to Randy Mattori and to Laurent Dubois and to everyone at the Center for African American Research and in the Department of African and African American Studies for the invitation to present my work in your series. I am very grateful and honored to be here because there are so many people who are affiliated with the center, who are in the department, who are in this room, whose work has inspired and crucially shaped my own. So it is really an honor to be here. What I'm going to be discussing today does come from the book that Vince just mentioned, just finished. The book focuses on the history and legacy of laws against popular ritual, late colonial Saint-Domingue to mid-20th century Haiti, and so I'm taking a piece of that today. We'll very much look forward to your questions, comments, critiques afterwards. So shortly after the catastrophic earthquake hit Haiti on January 12, 2010, editorials appeared in high circulation U.S. newspapers claiming that the Vodou religion, glossed as voodoo, was a progress impeding and poverty-producing force in the country. David Brooks in the New York Times made that contention the grounds for his conclusion that a more quote-unquote intrusive paternalism was called for on the part of the international community towards Haiti. He asserted that this would represent a break with the quote-unquote same old approaches to development. And of course, there was nothing new in Brooks's prescription of such a solution, nor in his and others' claims that voodoo obstructed progress and contributed to or even produced poverty in Haiti. And I discussed this briefly during the excellent conference that Laurent Dubois, Deborah Jensen, and Jean Casimir organized last spring, entitled Haiti's History Foundations for the Future. So today I'd like to look a little bit more closely at how the U.S. occupation between 1915 and 1934 was a particularly important crucible for the development of such ideologies about the Vodou religion, as much as they were very long in the making before this, of course. Specifically, in focusing on the occupation today, I'm interested in how the repression of Vodou by Marines during those 19 years played a key role in shaping the images of and ideas about Haitian popular ritual practice that circulated internationally thereafter. I also want to spotlight and analyze here the ways in which U.S. military policies against what they termed voodoo frequently ran aground and backfired. practitioners, elite Haitian opponents of the occupation, and Marines themselves all interpreted the U.S. regime against voodoo in their own ways, and frequently, as it turned out, in ways antithetical to how U.S. officials were justifying this campaign in the first place. Moreover, some of the images of quote-unquote voodoo that the occupation put into international circulation were arguably embedded with the seeds of their own critique. And so I'll close the talk today with an analysis of how one of the most enduring figures of occupation-era representation, the quote-unquote zombie, can be read as an incisive popular critique of the occupation's profound socioeconomic disruptions in rural Haiti between 1915 and 1934. So the first, to begin, the first U.S. occupation of Haiti needs to be situated, of course, in the larger history of U.S. military invasion, territorial acquisition in the Caribbean, Latin America, elsewhere intensifying after 1898. As elsewhere in the Caribbean, one of Washington's foremost strategic concerns in terms of Haiti was over what it saw as a growing German influence on Haitian affairs in the context of the country's maddening foreign indebtedness and internal political instability. So Washington, it seems, had actually been anticipating an invasion of Haiti for at least a year, when in late July 1915, the killing of 173 political prisoners in Port-au-Prince, and then the Haitian president's own death at the hands of a mob thereafter, provided the pretext for the occupation that would last the next 19 years. After the invasion, U.S. officials installed a client president, took control of the custom houses, imposed martial law and press censorship, disbanded the Haitian army, and organized a gendarmerie officered by Marines. In 1917, they engineered the dissolution of the Haitian legislature when it refused to endorse a rewriting, a U.S. rewriting, of the Haitian Constitution that legalized foreign land ownership for the first time in the history of the country. So there's been a good deal of attention paid in the scholarship on the occupation to how the United States secured military and economic control of Haiti by revoking existing Haitian laws and enacting, pushing through new ones. And the foremost example of that, of course, is this rewriting of the Haitian Constitution. Yet, I would argue that as much as U.S. control in Haiti was affected by the imposition of martial law, press censorship, and efforts to alter the country's laws, it was also, and perhaps even more pervasively affected through the occupation's enforcement of selected existing Haitian laws, with opportunistic disregard for the fact that some of these laws were either not applied or not strictly applied, customarily. A particularly infamous example of this was the U.S. military imposition of the corvée, or labor crew for road construction across central and northern Haiti early in the occupation. Marine officials found this pretty much obsolete statute of the Haitian Rural Code that required local residents to undertake road repairs, not road construction, in their vicinity. And between 1917 and 1918, Marine officials enforced this law in building a system of passable roads across the country, primarily to secure the occupation against popular insurgency. So workers were forcibly conscripted, they were roped together to travel to and from corvée camps, they labored under armed guard, and in fact, it was not only rural peasants who were subject to this, but pioneer ethnologist, founder of Haitian ethnology, Jean Price Mars, was himself briefly detained until they realized who he was. So those who attempted to escape these camps, these work sites, were fired upon. Understandably, Haitians likened the corvée to slavery. This became a rallying cry for popular armed resistance by insurgents called Kako, whose loosely organized forces had been suppressed earlier on in the occupation, but redoubled with the corvée. By 1918, there was a major popular insurgency in large areas of central and northern Haiti, under the leadership of two major figures, Charlemagne Perrault and Benoit Matreville. So in essence, this public works project that was originally instituted by military officials to secure the pacification of the country became by 1918 the most immediate catalyst for armed rebellion. And this prompted the writer James Weldon Johnson, who was a prominent critic of the occupation, to remark that, quote, the occupation continues to make the occupation necessary, unquote. So this is a slide of Marines on patrol looking for insurgents led by a guide. And this is a photo of Charlemagne Perrault, who was the foremost insurgent leader until his assassination by Marines in October of 1919. The corvée was definitely the most widely publicized case of Marines selectively and opportunistically deploying existing Haitian laws towards military ends. But it generated such massive opposition across rural Haiti that its imposition was relatively short-lived. There were other laws that were not usually strictly enforced by Haitian authorities that remained a legal means of repression and an object of popular resistance over the course of the entire occupation. Foremost among these was, in my view, was the Haitian penal law against le vaudou, which in the 1864 Haitian Penal Code then in effect, and hopefully everyone has a handout of this, as you can see, was classified, le vaudou was classified as a form of sortilège, or spell. Even though practitioners constructed such practices that were family-based, temple-based, socially sanctioned, to be constitutively opposed to any form of malicious magic. And then we can talk more later, if you like, about the history of this statute and why laws prohibiting vaudou were on the books in Haiti from 1835 until just after the fall of Jean-Claude Duvalier in 1986. They were stricken from the books in 1987 with the passage of the first Duvalier Constitution. And a major motivating question for my book has been, why were they on the books? Why were they maintained over the course of so many years when it was politically impossible for Haitian authorities to enforce them strictly or consistently? But what's striking to note is that during the occupation is that this law against sortilège, or spells, was one of only 3 penal laws, that against vagrancy was another, that were included in the sole English language legal handbook that was distributed to U.S. forces in Haiti during the first 7 years of the occupation. So they translated the Haitian Rural Code in effect at this time, and they added only 3 penal laws onto that, and the law against sortilège, which included the law against vaudou, was one of those laws and vagrancy was another. So how do we account for the prioritization of those penal laws, and that against sortilège and the vaudou in particular, out of the 413 articles that then comprise the Haitian Penal Code? For one thing, both the law against vagrancy and the law against les sortilèges, spells, were applied during the occupation to compel peasant labor. And I first heard about this from elderly Ungan, or vaudou priests, with whom I spoke during my research. And what they said was borne out in marine memoirs, marine oral histories from the occupation. a Marine named Faustin Workus, co-author of one of the best known of these memoirs. His was entitled The White King of La Gonave. He noted that in his first posting in the Artibonite Valley, whenever he needed manual labor for construction projects, he would make arrests on charges of vagrancy or quote-unquote spell-making with the complicity of the local juge de paix. And in a sense, the prohibition of sortilège was the most effective penal law to apply to such ends, because if it was read as targeting family-based ritual practice and applied by American Marines with really little concern for the political consequences of its strict enforcement, that statute could incriminate a majority of the Haitian rural population at one time or another. Beyond the exploitation of this law against vaudou for labor, though, its prioritization was also, of course, consistent with U.S. military official rhetoric about their quote-unquote civilizing mission in Haiti during especially the first several years of the occupation. So the repression of quote-unquote voodoo was a recurrent theme of U.S. official self-congratulation. It was figured as this exemplary way by which Marines were restoring the rule of law and quote-unquote moral decency in Haiti. So at one time or another, voodoo was charged by occupation officials as being anathema to civil peace, good government, justice in the courts, foreign investment, public hygiene, and the economic, physical, and moral well-being of the population. So its repression became thus a cornerstone of the occupation's paternalistic ideology of uplift, and thus of its self-justification. And of course, you heard the echo of all of this in the David Brooks editorial that I quoted from at the start. The Haitian law against vaudou was enforced especially severely during the 1918-1919 popular insurgency against the occupation, which American officials often claimed was led by quote-unquote voodoo priests, who they charged could manipulate the peasantry at will. And by voodoo priests, they meant male and female religious elders, called them grand mambo, although they were particularly concerned about male priests and their role in leading the insurgency. And it's not as though U.S. military identification of the rebellion with popular religion and with magical practice was entirely off base. There's certainly evidence to suggest that popular religious leadership and organization were a locus and force of peasant opposition during these years. So the question for me has been more how imperial fantasies about voodoo that circulated among Marines in Haiti became an alibi for the severe enforcement of the Haitian Penal Code against sortilège, and for the brutal forms that, according to Marine Corps records themselves, the counterinsurgency took. Reading official reports and also Marine writings, one sees how this is a case where the barbarism that was projected onto the rebels, primarily through their ascribed association with voodoo, was also then enacted upon them by some Marines and then invoked to justify lapses from what were characterized as quote-unquote the rules of civilized warfare. It doesn't seem incidental that the case that brought the extent of Marine abuses in Haiti to widespread public attention in 1919 was the summary execution of an elderly Ungan north of Port-au-Prince. And his name was probably Destin Jean. Marine records are unclear about this, and in fact, all of the records about this case are missing from the U.S. National Archives. That was one of the big use cases of this project. I tried to track them down through the Marines Library and Archives, and then they sent me to the U.S. National Archives. And it seems as if those records were pulled during the Senate investigation on the occupation, and then either through incompetence or through deliberation, not returned. Okay, so I wasn't able to find them at all. Two Marines were court-martialed for executing Jean and another prisoner in Croix-de-Bouffay. And the attorney for one of them defended his client on the grounds that he had only been following general custom in shooting prisoners. And the uproar over that claim, when it got leaked to the press in 1920, both in Haiti and the US, led to a number of military investigations and ultimately to these months of Senate hearings in 1921, 1922. So it was the summary execution of Anungan, it seemed, that led to this investigation. Yet again and again, during these Senate hearings in 1921-22, when you read the thousands of pages of proceedings, you find there's this slippage in the object of official inquiry. When the committee that was convened to investigate reports of marine atrocity against Haitians repeatedly turned to stories of alleged Haitian atrocities against Marines, often at the center of which lay imperial myths of human sacrifice and cannibalism as supposed rites of quote-unquote voodoo. If the summary executions and other marine abuses against Haitians uncovered in these investigations were ultimately dismissed in the course of the Senate investigation as the isolated misdeeds of a small number of individual malefactors, the atrocities allegedly committed against 2 U.S. Marines by Haitian insurgents were not treated as isolated during the Senate hearings. Rather, in part because of their presumed connection to voodoo, these cases were often taken as an extreme sign of a more generalizable barbarism. After the popular insurgency was suppressed in 1921, the penal regime against Vaudou continued to be enforced. But what's clear is that its severity varied from district to district across the country. There was this confidential Marine-generated census of quote-unquote voodoo people that was done in 1925. And that census, along with arrest records from the mid-1920s, show the unevenness of the enforcement of the law against Vaudou across the country. And this is, this is a page from that census of, again, quote-unquote voodoo people, listing names, title, location, in this case, it's Jérémy in the southwestern peninsula. So, for example, like looking through this census and then arrest records, you find that in one district, in, again, the southwestern peninsula, it's not this one, there were hundreds of Unga and Mambo listed in the census. But in a neighboring district in the southwestern peninsula, it was reported that, quote, so far as is known, there is no voodooism being practiced there at the present time. And when that report came in, the officials back in Port-au-Prince was like, this is not adequate, this is not sufficient, go back, that can't be true. And so they went back and they were like, no, really, we checked with, local judges and we checked with local priests, really there's no voodooism being practiced there at that time. So such reports reflected different interpretations among Marines themselves about what exactly voodoo was, and thus what the object of their penalization should be. This exemplifies one way in which the policy of strict enforcement of these laws by Marines frequently broke down in confusion and backfired. And in fact, Marines reported that in some local communities, people were calling upon them to arrest those accused of malicious magic, which was a reasonable request insofar as the penal code laws prohibited spells. So in other words, when U.S. military officials announced that they were going to severely enforce the statute against sortilège or spells, people took them at their word sometimes. And so Marines complained to their superiors that they were being pressured to apply these laws in ways that seemed to them more powerfully to confirm what they saw as superstitious beliefs, rather than to have any effect of undermining them. So the strict enforcement of the law could serve, to instantiate such beliefs, rather than, as occupation officials claim, to weaken or to eliminate them. There's a popular expression in Creole that I found very incisive in looking at these histories, and it goes, "Loi toujours gagne, nous attrape là-dedans." Law always has a trap inside of it. And this needs to be understood as commenting first and foremost on the long history of ruling class and foreign manipulation of the Haitian legal system and Haitian laws to exploit peasantry and particularly to appropriate peasant lands. But I think that expression also comments on the potential trickiness of laws more generally, and perhaps especially the trickiness of these laws against spells, as Marine found themselves implicated in the popular logic of sorcery in attempting to enforce the law against it. Marine records and oral historical accounts also document the multiple ways in which Vodou practitioners evaded and resisted the penal regime against socially sanctioned popular religious practices. They disguised ceremonies under the cover of social dances. They stuffed drums with cotton fibers in order to muffle their sounds. They replaced drums altogether with bamboo tubes that were softly tapped, or they replaced them with hand clapping. Sometimes people also used counterintelligence, so they would publicize false information about where or when a service or a service was going to take place, and they would move it elsewhere. What's also clear is that throughout the waves of repression to which they were subject during the occupation, popular stories were circulating, not of defeat, but rather, to the contrary, of the resilience and the transcendence of spirits in the face of persecution, and of the affliction, the capitulation, the conversion of those who attempted to suppress popular religious practice. There were stories of Marines being drawn to serve the loi themselves, stories of confiscated drums that began to boom inexplicably when taken to police headquarters, of terrible misfortunes befalling all of those who were involved in closing down sites of annual pilgrimage near the sacred waterfalls of Sodom. So such stories tell a counter-history in which the spirits, the loi, are consistently ascendant over the law, or la loi. And its would-be enforcers, the law's would-be enforcers, are ultimately forced, in the face of their confrontation with these higher powers, to soften their regime or to even honor the spirits themselves. It's clear, however, that even if people were shaping the enforcement of these laws and finding ways to circumvent and reinterpret them, the repression of family-based and temple-based religious practices remained severe in many parts of the country over the course of the occupation. So during my research, I was puzzled by accusations that I kept coming across on the part of some urban elites and middle-class Haitian opponents of the occupation, who were not themselves defenders of Vodou, but they charged Marines with encouraging Vodou, promoting Vodou, to the end of denigrating Haiti's reputation abroad. So, for example, in 1921, there was this anti-occupation newspaper, the Haitian Courier, the Courrier Haitien, that published an anonymous article in which the author wrote, quote, "One of my principal grievances against the occupation and the officers of the gendarmerie is that 6 years after they're governing us, they, the quote-unquote civilizers, have done everything they can to spread and diffuse Vodun, unquote. So I kept coming across charges like that on the parts of middle class and elite Haitian opponents of the occupation, and just wondered how could that be? Like, what did that mean, given the severity with which Marines generally enforced the law against Vodun? If, though, we understand what was quote-unquote being promoted by Marines as clearly not the Vodun religion, but rather the ideological construct of voodoo, then I think those charges make a lot of sense. Then I think you could say that voodoo was spread or diffused during the occupation, not in spite of U.S. repression against Vodun, but rather in some sense partly because of it. So during the remainder of the talk, I'd like to look at how Marine repression of Haitian religious practice played what I think was a key role in the construction, the commoditization, and the circulation of this ideological object called voodoo during the 1920s and thereafter. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that the U.S. military, the Marines, had some kind of monopoly on all of the kinds of images of voodoo that circulated, or that those should be understood as having been purely instrumental in justifying the occupation of Haiti. But rather, I want to argue that Marine repression of Vodun both incited further international fascination for voodoo and shaped the ways in which it was seen internationally in the 1920s and 1930s and beyond. And of course, it's also important to note that there were very important, powerful, countervailing images of Vodun produced during these same years in the Haitian literary indigenism movement, the founding of the Haitian School of Ethnology, and Jean Price-Mars's work in particular, of course. So I'll just give you a few examples of what I see as the connection between Marine repression of Vodun and the production of voodoo during the occupation. In contexts ranging from the U.S. Senate hearings to lectures before the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., you had Marines being credited as experts on quote-unquote voodoo. So their self-proclaimed ethnographic authority derived very directly from their military authority and the proximity it seemed to afford them to these practices through raids on temples and ceremonies. So among the Marines, you had some who were clearly fascinated by what they called voodoo and who admitted to seeking out any opportunity to raid services or services, so that their surveillance of ritual practices became the opportunity for voyeurism. The confiscation of sacred objects became the pretext for personal appropriation. Faustin Workus, again the Marine that I mentioned earlier, was particularly forthright about this, and he wrote in his memoir, quote, "As an enforcer of the law, I had to learn all I could about these rites which I was sworn to suppress. To satisfy my personal curiosity, I preferred gaining friendly admission into voodoo ceremonies, but by raiding them, I found out a great deal that would otherwise have taken many months and infinite patience," unquote. According to the Haitian Penal Code, as you can see from the handout, any ritual instruments, utensils, and costumes confiscated during raids were supposed to be destroyed. But the truth is that many Marines returned home with these items, especially drums, but also other sacred ceremonial objects, some of which were eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution and to natural history museums, which really built up started their Haitian collections during the occupation and thereafter. This is a photo of Captain John Houston Crage, one-time police chief of Port-au-Prince, taken after he returned home to Philadelphia And he had posing with drums that he had in his basement that he confiscated while he was in Haiti. He later donated them to the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where they joined another confiscated drum. This one, as you can see, had its head slashed. And some of the drums that were donated to the Smithsonian, if you go, they have a center for their object collections. If you go there, some of these drums had their heads punctured and slashed as well. And so I've been trying to understand what compelled the severing of these drum heads, which would seem gratuitous, like once the drums were already in Marine custody, and as prescribed by law, supposed to be destroyed. If you have any ideas about that, comparative cases, I'd be very interested. It's also clear that by the later occupation, there was already what you might call a burgeoning voodoo tourism economy in and around Port-au-Prince, and that the severity with which Marines and gendarmes enforced the law against vaudou was sometimes getting in the way of the desire of North American travelers to Haiti to see quote-unquote voodoo ceremonies. And I've come across a few cases of Marines actually arranging demonstrations in those cases. So you have the prohibition and repression of popular ritual practices becoming sometimes the occasion for their displaced and, in certain cases, forced reenactment. As when an American woman visiting a Marine post in the Artibonite Valley in the mid-20s asked the Marine station there where she could see a voodoo ceremony. They told her it was against the law, and then they summoned a prisoner to play for her on a confiscated drum. And this is a photo that she took of that performance, captioned "The Prisoner Who Drummed." Perhaps the highest profile case of Marines attempting to stage rituals that they were quote-unquote sworn to repress was when Faustin Workus returned to Haiti in 1931, 1932. He went back to La Gonave, the island where he was stationed, in order to make a short film entitled Voodoo, recruiting local people to perform ritual for the camera. This film was completed in 1933, and Workus's Voodoo was screened in theaters in New York, Los Angeles, across the country, as well as during the Marine lecture tours across the country. And it seems thereafter to have become one of this period's many ephemeral independent cinematic productions. I haven't been able to find, again, another goose chase, any copy of it in film archives, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, Marine Archives, etc. The few descriptions, this is Workus and a collaborator filming. The few descriptions we have of this film suggest that vaudou practitioners on La Gonave played a central role in its filming, the exact nature of which is, of course, unknowable at this point. Fragmentary evidence suggests that one or more of the women-dominated Société Congo, or agricultural work societies on La Gonave, into which Workus claims in his memoir to have been inducted, it seems that they may have organized their members to stage decontextualized performances, including sacrificial offerings, as the camera rolls. Their participation raises many, really unnatural questions at this point, including, under what premises did they agree to, forced to be involved in this film, what was the extent of the coercion, if they were told to perform themselves in scenes depicting ritual preparations and processes, what did they choose to depict, how did they choose to objectify those sacred practices. An advertisement for the film that appeared in newspapers in 1933 billed voodoo as the first authentic film record of the forbidden rituals of voodoo in Haiti. This production may well have been the first film representation of ritual staged by vaudou practitioners. But surely one reason why this film is unknown in the ethnographic film archive on Haiti today is that it was automatically assimilated, as its backers seem to have hoped, into the burgeoning horror film genre on account of its subject matter. So I just want to end now by talking about that genre a bit and how one of the most enduring figures of that genre, the quote-unquote zombie, can be read as a popular analysis and moral critique of the occupation's socioeconomic disruptions in rural Haiti, both those that stemmed from U.S. officials pushing through new laws and those that stemmed from opportunistic enforcement of customarily disregarded laws, like that against Vaudou. So a year before Workus's Voodoo was released in 1932, director Victor Halperin's classic horror film, White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi, established quote-unquote voodoo sorcery, and particularly this figure of the living dead, as cinematic, as fixtures of the cinematic horror imaginary. The film was set in Haiti, although it makes no reference to the still ongoing at that point occupation. But by this point, merely identifying the setting as Haiti sort of carried its own atmosphere, and United Artists focused on that angle in publicizing the film. So the press book for White Zombie announced that, quote, the story is based upon personal observation in Haiti by American writers and research workers, and fantastic as it sounds, its entire substance is based on facts. Cinema owners were urged to hang posters featuring, if you can see in the left corner, I know it's really obscured, in the left-hand corner of the poster, there was a translation of Haitian Penal Code Article 246, I think they got the number wrong here, under the heading Actual Extract from the Penal Code of Haiti. And next to that was a note, which in smaller print said, and you can't read that, it says, the practice of zombieism is punishable by death in Haiti, yet zombieism is being practiced in this country. So you see how like, the law against such practices could become perversely read as proof of the existence of zombieism in Haiti. Again, this idea of law having a trap inside of it. The key source for White Zombie was the 1929 best-selling travelogue, The Magic Island, by William B. Seabrook, who was not a Marine, but was certainly the writer most responsible for disseminating representations of quote-unquote voodoo based on military reports. And it's not clear how he had access to those reports, but he had like really extensive access to them. The best known scene from the film White Zombie was adapted and brought to life directly from the pages of Seabrook's travelogue. And this occurs very early when a wealthy white American plantation owner seeks out the help of a malevolent sugar baron played by Bela Lugosi at Bela Lugosi's sugar mill. And the American plantation owner wanted to win the affections of a woman who had just arrived from New York. The scene at the sugar mill is dominated by the mill itself, as operated entirely by Lugosi's crew of bacon-dyed zombies. In the chapter that Seabrook devotes to beliefs surrounding such beings in the Magic Islands, he recounts this elaborate rumor that he heard during his visit to the island again of La Gonave, off the west coast of Haiti. Namely, the story was that in 1918, a team of zombies reportedly toiled for several months at the newly opened Haitian American Sugar Company, or HASCO, the large American-owned sugar operation with factories, railway, extensive plantations, situated on the cul-de-sac and Léogane plains. And this rumor went, according to Seabrook, the company had offered a big bonus on the wages of new workers that season, and among those drawn by this prospect was a man named T. Joseph, who arrived, again, this is the story, at HASCO's registration offices with, as Seabrook notes, I'll quote, a band of ragged creatures who shuffled along behind him, staring dumbly like the people walking in a daze, unquote. And so T. Joseph claimed that these companions, whose work in the fields he would supervise, he claimed they were mountain people who didn't understand Plains Creole. But actually, according to this rumor, according to this story, they were zombies under his mastery. And so Seabrook writes in the Magic Island of his astonishment at hearing of such events associated with Haskell, which he describes as perhaps, quote, the last name anybody would think of connecting with sorcery or superstition. He carried on, quote, the word is American commercial synthetic, like Nabisco, Delco, Saucony. It is an immense factory plant dominated by a huge chimney with clanging machinery, steam whistles, freight cars. It's like a chunk of Hoboken. It's modern big business, and it sounds, looks, and smells it. But the association with Haskell, with sorcery was, of course, by no means as incongruous as Seabrook claims. As the largest U.S.-owned enterprise in Haiti, the foremost icon of the agribusiness that was steadily displacing peasant sharecroppers across this region, Haskell was, to the contrary, a highly likely object of sorcery rumor in early occupation Cul-de-Sac and Léogâne. Indeed, that this course of events was said to have taken place in 1918 is noteworthy in itself, because that was the year that Haskell factories in the Cul-de-Sac Lane opened. It was the year that the company made its first harvest. It was also 1918 when popular outrage over the corvée system of forced labor reached its height. And in June of that year, the new U.S.-sponsored Haitian Constitution authorizing foreign land ownership was pushed through. The figure of T. Joseph in Seabrook's story seems himself plausible, given that Haskell sub-hired all of its wage workers through gang bosses. Karen Richmond has examined, and she's an anthropologist at Notre Dame, she's examined the stigmatization of wage labor today in parts of the plain of Léogâne once dominated by Haskell. And she notes that independent farmers who at some point in their lives have been forced by economic necessity to perform agricultural labor, wage labor, usually leave the community to pursue this. And so she notes it's generally quote-unquote outsiders and mountain people who perform agricultural day labor in the area. And locals, at the time of her research, sometimes derisively referred to them as zombies. So contrary to Seabrook's astonishment of the association of Haskell with sorcery, could there have been a more fitting image for and incisive commentary on the proletarianization of the displaced Haitian peasant farmer or sharecropper, or for that matter, the forced labor to which the rural poor were subject on the corvée in 1917 and 1918, than a crew of zombies toiling in the Haskell cane fields? I think that story might be read productively alongside a letter which a group of Haskell wage workers sent to the director of the company in late 1917, early 1918, demanding a day of 8 hours instead of 10. They wanted a 10% augmentation of salary, and they warned that otherwise we will be forced to abandon this company and go to the Dominican Republic or Cuba for better conditions, unquote. Like that petition, I would argue that the story of the zombie slaving at Haskell can be read as relating a powerful social analysis and indictment of the encompassing of rural life in these plains by North American capitalist enterprise during these years. And I think you can really posit a connection between those two texts, the story of the zombie and this workers' petition, both critically assessing the experience of rural proletarianization under the occupation. Ironically, in Seabrook's hands, the story, that rumor's social critique, became the vehicle for the export of another kind of commodity, the hybridized specter of the zombie, that over the next decade actually proved far more lucrative for American investors than most of the fly-by-night agricultural operations that came and went in rural Haiti during the occupation. And you could argue, I think, in fact, that the production of quote-unquote voodoo was one of the occupation's most profitable commodities. Seabrook's report, in closing, of the rumor of zombie forced into labor at Haskell raises the question of whether the occupation's manifold disruptions of rural life intensified and redirected fears of supernatural aggression in particularly affected regions of Haiti. And any study of that question, I think, would need to take into consideration both North American capitalist penetration in those areas and marine enforcement of the Pinot regime against spells. In this sense, the tale of Zombie toiling at Hasco might be understood to bring together and comment on the two principal ways in which U.S. officials in Haiti between 1915 and 1934 manipulated the Haitian legal corpus. On the one hand, through the revocation of existing laws that obstructed their military and financial control in Haiti, and on the other hand, through the enforcement of laws, such as that against Faudon, in violation of customary norms. So if the stories of spiritual corruption and aggression, focused on new agents and new objects in the drastically reorganized rural conditions of places like the Léogane and Cul-de-Sac plains during the occupation, so too did those conditions and the regimes that produced them become the object, I think, of powerful social analysis and moral critique through these kinds of stories. Thank you very much.
So we've got some time for questions. I see John.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm a Brazilianist, and you had a couple of sort of invitations to talk parallels or possible suggestions. The first of them was that in this, you just talked about the idea that the Marines enforce these laws, these legal provisions against Vodun spells in violation of customary norms. And I'm really I really have my doubts about it, and I think this may explain in part why the 1925 story of one district having a lot of them and one district having none. Because if you look at the history of Afro-Brazilian religions, and there's many, many similarities to stories you tell, including the types of stories about the police chief is himself really a follower of it, and you know, all of those sorts of things are very normal parts of the story. But a lot of it has to do with, I mean, and also Brazil, including Salvador, only eliminated its laws restricting, forcing you to register with police and things like that in the 1970s as well. But the point of having these laws on the thing is that it makes a need for patrons on the part of the people involved with these activities. And when you say that he says that we couldn't find any, the God headquarters says go back and look again, and then he says I asked judges, I asked the local elites. It's that these people, the very fact that this has come back for a second request, this gives them leverage and tightens the bond. So you really, the other place that denounces 100 is really a place where the local relations between these people and the local power authorities that would be spoken to are not particularly tight, or where there's disputes going on over which ones get protected or which ones don't. Because this repression is never, I mean, Brazilian enforcement, I mean, there's also some mythic representations and things, but the Brazilian enforcement has always been, but it's meant to be, historically in the early 20th century and even later, meant to be erratic. It's meant to hit some people and not others, and it's on the basis of which protection you've got. So it would even make sense that some of these Marines would be being taken in as protectors of a particular group and things is not to be ruled out. The other thing is that the other part that the thing about the opposition, the opponents of the occupation, urban groups and things like that, charging them with building it up and encouraging it and so on and so forth. I think that I would tend to think that you don't need to go as metaphorical as the production of the product and the commoditization of the idea of Vodun and all the rest of it, but rather think about it as the struggle in a context of radical stigmatization of entire countries in a racist world with the idea that you stand by the most backward practices that the country represents, and then the people struggling against it, especially people who are educated. The question of saying, no, Vodun is great, it's wonderful, it's Haiti, is not really possible in that ideological world, that moment of time. But rather, the idea, the resistance, I mean, the idea that the guy's saying that this is what makes me most angry, that really in some ways ties as well to the fact that there's internal divisions within Haiti, which is why the laws exist to begin with. It's Some people follow it, some people don't. Everyone knows it's part of your world, but on the other, you know what I mean? It's like, so in some ways the two things go together, but it does seem to me not at all unlike, you know, I mean, obviously we have other people here that are knowledgeable about world economy later, but that was my thought anyway.
Those are extremely helpful, and I really appreciate any kind of comparative perspective on this, because I think I recognize so much of what you're arguing in what I've found in my research. I think that, I mean, exactly as you say, at a certain point, it seems that the regime began to sort of revert back to more customary norms. And this is when, to begin with, during the occupation, the U.S. officials eliminated the Haitian army, and they also completely changed the policing structure, and the Marines were going to be at the head of that, and they received a promotion of 1 grade, and they were stationed throughout the country. As time went on, especially after the insurgency was put down, the institution of the chef de section, essentially, the section chief, the rural police officer, was instantiated again across the country. And at this point, you do see, I think, in the arrest records that I've been able to look at, that there is more kind of adherence to popular understandings of what the just object of these laws should be, and that is malicious magic or sorcery. And that's when you start getting complaints on the part of Marines that, well, you know, isn't this just confirming these beliefs rather than undermining them? But I think that the point that you're making, one of the questions that has really motivated my study has been, why were these laws kept on the books, you know, for so many years, from 1835 until 1987, effectively, especially when they were not, and they could not be, enforced in a strict or sustained way against family-based, temple-based, socially sanctioned, popular religious practices. And so there are different ways of understanding that. I have certainly looked at the way these laws were part of a battery of other laws, especially those that were contained in the Haitian Rural Code that targeted the peasantry specifically, and became a means to contain them effectively by technically criminalizing practices that were so central to the social fabric of their lives and worlds. And these laws, you know, both enabled their political marginalization, certainly their social stigmatization, also their economic exploitation, which is what I wanted to also pick up from your comment, because rural police officers were, you know, either had very small salaries or they weren't paid, and so they were extracting fees from people who were mounting particular ceremonies according to the scale and scope of those ceremonies, and augmenting their salaries with them. So I think it is crucial, even though it's very difficult historically to localize and realize that all the these are not homogenous communities, and they're socially stratified in all kinds of different ways. And there was also call for these laws to exist. That was one of the very difficult realizations of my research. You know, was that yes, it's very important that they were attempting to shape the regime away from family-based religious practices, but they were also calling for sorcery accusations to be publicly adjudicated, you know, on the basis of these laws.
Randy?
Very interesting. I really enjoyed that, Kate. As you pointed out toward the end of your position, I was just going to observe that the Vodou constituted an alternative font of power and social organization rival to the state. That's one obvious reason that the laws would be useful.
Right.
And another obvious reason is that nation states operate in an international arena in which their reputations count. So for the state that's suspected of being a state of savages to declare oneself against savagery is an important public relations statement.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts on the similarity between the word for the gods and the term for law, loi, which would seem to be central to the metaphors you're making.
How many years I was into the project when it suddenly struck me.
I don't know why it has been more taken up. Joan Diane has also written about it more recently. But I think that when Herskovitz spells the word loi, L-O-A, it like threw people off track, you know? But I mean, even though the word loi is L-W-A now in Creole, is understood to be part of a family of your words, and so there's an etymological derivation there. I still think it's a really important and fascinating question to ask, because in the course of my research, I noticed how that homology became a point of great semantic confusion, not least for the American military officials who were like trying to, try these high-profile cases. There's one case I look at very briefly in the introduction where the transcript from this trial of a very well-known priest of Vodou says at one point, it was translated as, what were you doing at the ceremony? Well, we were giving the law something to eat. I just think it's a really important question, and I have not begun to, do justice to it or exhaust the possible analysis.
It reminds me of the similarity between the term for nation, meaning nation states, and nation or nation and nation in the religions all around the Americas, these African religions. Yeah, so that people are taking the substance of the state's claim to authority to have an alternative meaning that justifies something else, and so the sorts of resistance and ambivalence that people are feeling are never revealed, but they're evident in their vocabulary. The duality of meaning and sense of identity and belonging, they never have to disambiguate.
That's really helpful.
In Spanish and Portuguese, there's actually the word nation has this utility even before you get Africa and New World thing involved, because we had a fascinating, about 10 years ago, fascinating set of things on the Jews expelled from Portugal. And when they're expelled and they go elsewhere in Europe, they call themselves the Nação Portuguesa and things like the Portuguese nation. So there actually there's an Iberian understanding of what a nation is, which partially explains why you have African nations in so many countries, both Spanish and Portuguese. It actually goes way back. That's also where Ladina comes from.
So fascinating talk. Thank you, as always. I'm reminded by recent U.S. history that occupation also always has a trap inside of it. And I've become interested in a writer named Stan Goff, who was a Delta Forces, Special Forces soldier, both in Vietnam but also in the 1994 invasion of Haiti. He's got an interesting line in his book called Full Spectrum Disorder about his time in Vietnam. At the end of the prologue, he says, I learned many things during my time in Vietnam. Most of them not what I was sent there to learn, right? And he ends that chapter, that prologue, by saying, now I've become Viet Cong. And then he goes on to describe the story of his role in the 1994 occupation of Haiti, where he finds himself acting as a kind of viceroy of a small corner of northwest Haiti, where he says he goes crazy and he begins writing. And he begins writing from a communist perspective, and he becomes, as well, a voodoo practitioner. He thinks, or he becomes enamored of voodoo. So I'm wondering about the soldiers, and I'm wondering if any of these soldiers don't see themselves after the occupation as representatives of the state, of the U.S. occupation, but as something else. If any of them go native, if any of them find themselves changed by the occupation itself in their encounter with this alternative power.
Absolutely. And there's a case. It's pretty interesting. He was with the Navy, stationed in Haiti, sort of later in the occupation. His name was Stanley Reeser, and he according to reports, became initiated himself. He became a Mungan. He, after the occupation ended in 1934, he didn't leave. He was put in charge of an asylum for the mentally ill. And from there, he became a kind of broker for a number of researchers who traveled to Haiti because the occupation stimulated a great deal of anthropological interest in the country and in Vodou. So, Herskovitz knew him, and Catherine Dunham when she came, and he helped her a lot, and Alan Lomax. So he actually became a kind of I don't know, intermediary for these researchers who were coming from the U.S. to Haiti. Alfred Matreau and also a Haitian ethnologist, esotericist named Nino Rigaud also write about a Marine officer who was apotheosized as a figure named Captain Deva, who had a very salty, performance. If you were spiritually embodied with him and wanted to sing sea shanties and eat corned beef. So, I mean, it was kind of assimilated, at least in this case. But I must look at Standoff's book. I feel like I've been remiss.
Hideous Dream is the book that specifically is memoir on the Haitian occupation,
right.
and Full Spectrum Disorder is the larger book.
Yeah.
It's a bit more theoretical.
Right. So there are definitely analogs and parallels in the first occupation.
I had kind of a specific question. You mentioned at one point the Marines broke up pilgrimages to Soudou, and I was wondering, do you have any specific narratives or testimonies of that?
Yes. Jean-Price Mars writes about this, and also Herskovitz writes about that. So I would look in, so Spoke the Uncle, and then also in Life in the Haitian Valley. And Herskovitz is also drawing on Price Mars's work. So those are two accounts. Yeah. That really took place.
John? Deborah?
Since there's so many debates about the origins of the notion and the term zombie, I just wondered what your take is on the history, the etymologies.
That's a question that I have relied on other scholars primarily. Doris Garraway's book, The Libertine Colony, she looks at different possible etymologies of that word, and she also looks, as far as I know, its first appearance in print, which was in the title of a late 17th century novel, right? I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was basically about this woman who was infatuated with another, colonial figure, and basically asked to be turned into this spectral figure, the zombie, to wreak havoc on anyone else who entered his bedroom, and so it was actually, in that case, it sounds a bit different. It was, it enabled this kind of agency on her part. But I haven't read the novel myself. It's on my list. But it's a question that I've really been interested in. That Jean and John Komaroff have an important article on the sort of appearance of the zombie in any place where the organization of labor has been very severely disrupted, and what's tantalizing and frustrating to me is that they don't talk about etymology in that article, so I'm still trying to piece it together. Yeah.
Because there are some 19th century French suggestions that it just comes from les ombres, just the shades. Which works perfectly on a phonetic level, just zone, but seems unlikely to encompass all of the. It's just an interesting question.
It is. It's similar to what we were just talking about with Ron.
Random, and there's so many different.
So many different possibilities.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
As you probably know, Nzambi Mpungu is one Central African name for God, the high God.
Exactly. It's also a full day common name, Samba, which is a slight variation of which a lot of people in the Americas carry that name.
John?
Yeah, I was just going to return to the question about law, not in terms of the two things, but rather how you understand the law, which is a customary norm. Because one of the things that I found in writing this book about Brazilian law, and my wife also works with legal anthropology on law, is the assumption, I don't think we really understand that the ideological product that's most deeply entrenched in the US and in the North Atlantic world in general is an understanding of the law from the point of view of 19th century liberalism. Because the understanding of the law is something that applied, that's meant to be applied and that's meant to make the world reflect what it is very, very different from the reality of law as it actually operates and is understood. So it's not so much the customary understandings, like you say, the customary understandings which is against malevolent spirit. Is that what you said? But remember, malevolent spirits is what your enemies do. It's what your rivals do. It's not what you do. So, of course, that really doesn't answer the question. So if I were going to think about the issue of trying to understand that this is a different way of conceptualizing law, and you pass laws that are never meant to be effective, you don't even fight about the laws because the laws don't matter. That's one level of the thing in Brazil. But the way I would put it is that the understanding of what you mean by law is to have the laws, and then on the part of the people below to violate them, which is fine, and to allow them to be violated.
Yeah.
All those three things are what the system works on. It works on the
Absolutely.
idea that these three things together is what constitutes the way law is meant to be. It's the way it is. To have them, which you need to have, to violate them, and to allow them to be violated. And then you've got lots of room for maneuver within all of it. Which is, so even if you resist the law against your religious practices, if you find an opportunity, and your buddy is the head delegado, and you can use it against a rival temple.
Right.
Why not?
Right.
You know what I mean? But if you didn't have the laws, you could lose that tool.
Yeah. Well, this is
this is what I'm saying. The question is the idea that law is, otherwise you assume customary understanding of that law to be X assumes that there's actually only one understanding of it as opposed to the idea that it's really an area of play.
That's a really important point. And it's interesting that the law that succeeded the one that I translated here, the year after the occupation ended in 1935, there was a new law passed against superstitious practices. Like that was the new legal objectification. And that law did not name any practices, but it made the litmus test of what was prohibited, the offering of sacrificed animals, okay? But it also at the same time affirmed the right of fellow people, as it put it, to dance, to have practice customary popular entertainments. And that had never been affirmed in the law before. So I think that there's a scholar named Lionel Corbon who has read this law as this kind of big juridical wink, saying, we know that, under the veil of these dances, you may be practicing ritual. And this has been going on for some time, but we're going to kind of construct the law in this way to kind of give you a pass on that. So that was one interpretation of that formulation, that legal formulation. But I absolutely agree, and I think that maybe hopefully, since it's already committed now, the book discusses this in more complexity than my talk did.
Did you want to say something? I wonder if you gave any thought to the racial vocabulary and focus of much of this writing and the poster, white zombie, white king, etc., and the scientific language, the pseudo-scientific language of even this poster. in light of this moment in U.S. history regarding race and segregation and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, exactly. And the fact that there were no Black Americans who were even permitted to be part of the Marine Force at this time, and not for until sometime later, where they're even segregated forces and Marines. So absolutely. And it's also, I mean, it's something that I've looked at as well in the later 19th century, when you have writers like Antonin Firmin, Joseph Janvier, Annabelle Priest, who are writing in a vindicationist mode against scientific racist writings, but also against the writings of just a whole slew of foreign ministers who came to Haiti and then did these exposés, and the way in which they deal with Vaudon in those rebuttals and texts in Firmin's case of very groundbreaking anthropology is so different from the way that Jean-Price Mars does. And so it's interesting, like in teaching, to kind of compare those texts, the equality of the human races by Firmin, and So Spoke the Uncle, around the question of popular religion. Because Firmin is, he doesn't, he kind of says that in Haiti at that moment, organized religion is really kind of dying. He says that actually that according to Comte, the quote-unquote fetishists will be excellent rationalists because they don't have to go through this dogmatic religious stage. But it is really on this very vertical kind of schema of progress. And I think Jean-Price Mars, by the time he writes So Spoke the Uncle, I mean, there's so many other factors here in Haitian intellectual history and other, confluences internationally at that moment that you've written about so much. He really has the insight that because these practices are so central to people's lives, and they can't even just be compartmentalized, as religion, they involve law and healing, medicine, and because they've been the object of such stigmatization, their decriminalization is really crucial for the emancipation of the peasantry, and
The reason I brought that up was I was thinking of the work of Cesare Lombroso and his influence on Nino Rodriguez and Fernando Ortiz, and overlapping with the U.S. discourse that the major fear, what these others were emphasizing was that the fear related to religion was that it would trickle up from these evolutionarily inferior black lower classes into evolutionarily inferior white lower classes, and then on up the ladder, of which this is sort of a motif.
Yes.
But the U.S. input is adding the fear of the seduction and rape of white women. She's lying there. And yet there's still this ambiguity that, not only the person seduced, kidnapped, and raped is a white woman, but there's a white man performing it, but he's sort of a white man who's a black man. And so this overlap between the Latin American science, whereby racial inferiority trickles up into white people, and the North American notion that it's basically hereditary and it doesn't happen, are overlapping in this kind of quasi-scientific document.
Yeah, it's so important. And it's also, I think it's, as I went on through the research and writing of this, it became clear to me that beyond what I was able to do in this project, taking a comparative transnational perspective is absolutely crucial, because of course the Marines were occupying Cuba, in from 1898 to 1902, and then from 1906 to 1909, these moments when there was panic in Cuba about brujeria, and about the
And
need
La Niña
for
Zoila,
exactly,
kidnapped white girl.
and the need for programs of social hygiene, coming right out of Lombroso, right? And that's how in Cuba, and I understand Brazil, I mean, ethnology to a great extent has roots in Lombrosian criminal anthropology and psychiatry in a way that it didn't in Haiti. It's interesting.
Well, go ahead.
Just as a naive question, but why not? I mean, what is it about Haiti that, I mean, is it not a threat I mean, it seems like the conversation amongst Haitian intellectuals is towards the outside world, or to the Americans who are occupying the country here and there, or to everybody else who wants to denigrate the possibility of an independent republic of Haiti. But they don't seem to be, at least from what I'm understanding, they don't seem to be terribly concerned with the criminality or the kinds of powers that might be appealed to by these kinds of practices. But the Americans, I mean, this is the American occupation seems to be worried about what these kinds of practices can actually do. Right? I mean, there's a reason. It does something, but they're afraid that it does something. It might be racial. It might be to do with the resistance. It might be the kinds of social organizations. But the Haitian elites, as I understand it, aren't terribly worried. They're not enforcing these laws in any kind of way. So, I mean, why is that? Do they share them? Is this something which is widely? I mean, is this kind of is it wrong to distinguish them in Haitian terms between regular Catholic practice or some sort of wider Haitian religious cultural approach to the world? I mean, I'm just wondering if you could maybe.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really excellent question. But I think that there was long a concern on the part of ruling classes in Haiti about the possibility that that what we call Vaudon, what outsiders started to call Vaudon, would be a kind of parallel power in the country, and this comes out of the role that is attributed to Vaudon in the overthrowing first of slavery and then French colonialism in Haiti. That's one of the ways in which I do understand these laws, even if they couldn't usually be strictly enforced against family-based, temple-based religious practices, or enforced in a sustained way. They still, again, did have material force in the kinds of ways that I talked about in stigmatization, marginalization, economic exploitation. And then sometimes, just because they were on the books, they always retained the potential of being enforced. And so in the book, I look at these flashpoints when they were strictly enforced, and it was often by foreign powers operating in Haiti, like the Catholic Church pressuring it, and then the Marines during the occupation. So I think that they still, even if they weren't enforced, they still had force. I mean, that's kind of my conclusion about these laws.
That's a good point about law every place.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's.
So these practices then were thought of by the Haitian elite as dangerous or as potentially dangerous.
As potentially.
Or as a source of power.
But also, they used these organizations, for their own purposes, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stories that, and this ethnologist, esotericist Milo Rago writes about them a great deal, of particular presidents who had, it was kind of public secret, like very close relations reportedly with, particularly prominent societies in different parts of the country. So it was also important for them politically to have those relationships. It just got more and more complicated. I found, François Duvalier attempted to instrumentalize Vodou organization. He attempted to sort of interpolate his own political persona in terms of Vodou imagery. His regime was noted to begin with supposedly for greater openness about Vodou practices. Never revoked that law. It remained on the books. And Unga I spoke to basically said, okay, there was more openness, but there was also more control because it was more centralized. And then I discovered very late in my research that under François and Jean-Claude Duvalier, these practices were still technically prohibited. The Institute of Haitian Statistics publicized in these trimestral reports the contribution of Unga and Mambo to the gross domestic product of Haiti. And they were classified, in under what was called the professional services sector, along with lawyers, with doctors, real estate agents, automotive repair people. It's a very capacious category.
This is in what document?
These are in these reports. I'm sure they have them at the library right here. And then I discovered that it wasn't just the Duvaliers who did that. These statistics were also being collected under Estimé and Magloire, the governments before Duvalier took power. And so it seems like an important. I talk about this in the epilogue to the book. This religion was one of the discourses against it was that it was an economic drain on the country, because it was exploiting, people who didn't have anything to give, in extracting various fees for services. And so, but here in the official documents of the state that is technically prohibiting these practices is an acknowledgement of, the extent to which, Ungam Mambo and various other ritual specialists were, contributing like the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Haitian economy, and there are all kinds of local economies around voodoo practice that, were not acknowledged as well in that line of argument against it. So it's, at some point I just had to say, okay, that's the end. I have to finish this book, but the kinds of questions that it raised are still ones that I'm turning over, and I really thank you so much for,
Well, we thank you for coming, and we can continue this discussion a little bit at a reception we've got going until 6 o'clock. Thanks.
Great food for thought, too.
It's really been